All right, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. So first off, I just want to thank everybody for coming today. We really appreciate you guys taking time out of what we know is a very busy time of the year. So I am Elisa Rippey-May. I'm the Livestock and Farm Management Agent here in the Twin Creeks District, which I'll skip to the next slide here. You can see that. So up here, kind of in this Northwest area, Decatur, Graham, Sheridan, and Norton counties. And I'm going to help moderate today along with Heather McDonald. So Heather, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sorry, had to get to my unmute button there. Yes, I'm Heather McDonald. I'm the livestock agent for the Sunflower District. So that's the very northwest corner. So Cheyenne, Sherman, and Wallace counties.
Excellent. Thank you, Heather. So this was kind of put together, started as a group of Northwest agents who were kind of interested in providing some drought management resources for livestock producers and seeing the need for that right now. I'll pull up our opening slide here and you can see that this is today's drought monitor. So we can see a lot of western and central Kansas. We have severe and extreme drought. And then there in the southwest corner is actually exceptional drought. So we know this is a needed topic right at the moment. So once we get done with this town hall, please continue to watch some of the resources that we're going to talk about here because we will be releasing some new things over the coming weeks. Okay. So we have a number of extension specialists on here today that we are very happy that they are here. If you guys could just go through and kind of introduce yourselves, maybe following that list, then we can get started with questions.
Yes, my name is Dale Blassie, Stocker Management Nutrition here in Manhattan, Kansas.
I'm Rachel Clues. I'm the Family Consumer Science Specialist for Southwest Kansas, but I also represent K-State on farm and ranch stress management.
Dustin Pendle, Department of Agriculture Economics, Livestock Production Economics.
Jamie Lynn Farney, Beef Systems Specialist, focus on nutrition and forage systems.
Walt Fick, I'm a professor and extension rangeland management specialist at the Department of Agronomy here at K-State.
Howdy there, I'm Keith Harmony. I'm a range scientist and I'm stationed at our research center out at Hays, Kansas.
Lucas Haig, I'm an extension agronomist and I work out of the Colby and Tribune locations.
Good afternoon, John Holman, research agronomist in Southwest Kansas and forage agronomist.
All right, Greg Ivendall, faculty member in Ag Econ. I work with Ag Finance, production issues, and also handle all the input issues, concerns.
Hi, I'm Jenny Ift, Ag Econ faculty member, Ag Policy Extension Specialist. I do work in livestock insurance, including LRP, livestock risk protection, and PRF, pasture insurance.
Hi, it's Annie Johnson. I'm a reproductive physiologist and work with a lot of cow-calf management issues located in Colby.
Jeannie Falk-Jones. I'm an extension agronomist, specifically focused in weed science, but look at lots of wheat and try to handle farmers' questions.
I'm Daniel O'Brien. I work with grain markets and help with farm management issues also.
Robin Reed, extension farm economist here at K-State Ag Econ, and do some work on cattle budgeting and farm policy as well, specifically USDA Farm Service Agency programs.
AJ Tarpoff, the beef extension veterinarian based in the Animal Science Department in Manhattan.
Justin Wagner, extension beef cattle specialist located in Garden City, Kansas, ruminant nutrition and beef cattle management.
All right, thank you all very much for introducing yourselves and for being here. So I think we're going to kick us off with a question that came in before the webinar. So either Keith or Walt, I think this would be in your wheelhouse. So lots of us have already gone to pasture this year. And we can see that growth isn't normal. So what do we need to do to monitor pastures? And then what would be a next important date if we needed to make some adjustments?
Well, I'll answer that. This is Keith out in Hayes. One of the things I guess for folks to look at is that our May and June precipitation in western Kansas is the most important precipitation that we receive through the year for being able to predict how much forage we're going to have at the end of the season. I put a little write-up that was included in the beef tips this last month that explained some of that, if you want to go back and read that. But essentially it tells the story that May and June precipitation for our western Kansas areas has a really good relationship with how much forage we'll have at the end of the season. That it's about the best predictor that we have. So anyway, at the end of that June time period would be a good indicator for you to look at the amount of precipitation you've had and be able to determine if you're going to have close to your expected end of year forage yield that you would have on average. So anyway, I would say by the end of May, if you're low on precipitation, if you're below average for May, that's something to get you to start thinking, maybe I'm not going to have enough forage at the end of the season for the stocking rate that I have out there right now. And by the end of June, you should be able to have a very good indicator of whether or not you're going to be overstocked or not, based on whether you've received your average amount of precipitation in May and June that you typically do.
Yeah, I don't know that I would add anything to what Keith has said. I think, as he says, that this early season precip is pretty important. Hopefully you've been thinking about it already, though, because of our projections are for, particularly, I think, in the western half of the state is warm and drier than normal. So that projection alone should had you at least thinking about what you might do under these circumstances. Grazing this time of the year is not near as detrimental as let's say overgrazing later in the season. But if the animals don't have enough forage right now, you're in a real hard situation and probably need to be thinking about maybe some sort of supplementation. And maybe Dale or somebody else could address those sort of issues. But yeah, I like June 15th as a target date if I was going to pick a date. But
for eastern Kansas, they have a longer growing season than what we do out west. So it's a little bit different relationship for those of you that may be in eastern Kansas, but for out west, from the data here at our research center, that May and June time period is the best indicator that I have, anyway, that I know of.
Yeah, certainly for eastern Kansas, our historic clip samples would suggest that crude protein increasing fiber content occurs typically the second week in June, and you start to see that decline.
As Keith talks about predicting, that May, June precip predicting end of season total production. The other way to think about that is sometime there in that June timeframe, by middle of June, or depending on where you're at in the state, 50% of our production should have occurred. And by middle of July, it's about 75%. But so again, that just emphasizes how important that early part of the season is.
Dr. Fick mentioned maybe supplementing cows. This might be a question best for Keith Harmony. that just came in. So if I feed some type of forage to my cows trying to save pasture, how much am I really saving?
That would kind of depend on what the quality of the forage is that you're feeding them. Some information from Nebraska has shown that when they do a mixture of some straw or some crop residues with distillers grains at I believe it was a 30% distillers grains, 70% roughage mixture, that they are able to get a 1-to-1 ratio of forage replaced. Supplemented forage was replacing the exact amount of grazed forage, but as they increased the quality of that mixture, so as they added more distillers grains, or as they used a better quality hay as the roughage in that mixture, the replacement ratio went down, so that they weren't getting as much forage replaced, because the higher quality there, those animals are going to have it's going to have a higher digestibility rate. Those animals are going to be having more intake. And so so up to a point, you can get an even match of supplement fed and pasture replaced, but as the quality of that supplement goes up, you get less pasture replacement. If that makes sense, if I stated that clear enough.
And I thought too, Justin Wagner might have something to add to this conversation.
Yeah, to agree with Keith there, the quality of the feeds and the forages with which we're feeding those cattle is going to determine that to some extent. Generally, as we think about energy supplements that would be fed to cattle, that substitution rate is anywhere from 0.5 to 1, meaning that a pound of some sort of energy supplement may spare as little as a half a pound of additional grazed forage, or in some cases as much of a pound. So it's certainly not as much as what we might think it could be in some scenarios, but it does certainly depend on the quality of those feedstuffs. Dale, you may have some comments on stocker cattle, but just very generally speaking as well.
I would agree as well. And you get your displacement, you can obviously carry more cattle with an energy source. Your density can occur, but it comes in an added price. So depends on what your objectives are, actually.
Thank you, guys.
Sandy, you might just comment on this time of the year, producers trying to get cattle bred and the quality of that forage in terms of.
Sure, as we look at, some people have started the breeding season or will be, and, we need those cows to be on a positive plane of nutrition. And if there is not enough forage, we can see those cows starting to go backwards. And I would be probably most concerned about, our young cows and replacement heifers, because of their higher nutrient demands. And then, of course, if cows were thin coming through the winter, and then, we're kind of relying on that spring green up to, get them cycling and in that positive energy balance we want, there could certainly be some problems there. So, I would encourage you to, observe your pastures in terms of what's going on. Do you see cows riding? If they still have hair, or the tail head shed off, use those signs. And then, when you do turn bulls out, if they're not out already, that you're spending a little time there to watch what's going on. And, I always felt like, whether I was checking cows in heat or watching bulls, it was just a chance to kind of catch your breath. And you don't have to be thinking about anything but see what those cows are doing, and take that as a chance to slow your mind down, I guess. But do be monitoring those throughout the season and understand the importance of condition and the amount of forage that's there.
And I just want to do a quick little piggyback onto that. For the fall herds, really get out and do your preg checking now. In the eastern side, where we do have a lot more cool season, because our winter was so terribly dry, a lot of our veterinarians we've been visiting with have been seeing a much higher open rate on our fall herds than we've typically seen. And, we're wondering if there was a reduction in total forage availability that wasn't quite accounted for appropriately. And if you need to save forage, get those open cows located and out as soon as possible.
Okay, so thank you guys. I want to add, for anybody who is watching this, if you guys want to ask questions, just use that Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. I'm sorry I didn't say that earlier. And then we did have one question come in, so probably Justin, this would go to you. If a producer needs to dry lot cows this summer, if they need to take them off that grass, what kind of ration could they be looking at, and then how much might that cost?
Okay, certainly there's a lot of maybe variables within that question. If we look at a scenario right now where we would potentially have pairs and be looking at dry lotting some pairs, that can be challenging. Oftentimes when we have done some dry lot work in research settings, we often provide some additional creep feed for those calves. My general recommendation with that is I would try to leave the pairs out in an extensive environment as long as possible before we get into the dry lot situation. In terms of commodities and use, I think that's one of the parts of this question here. Certainly it would be beneficial for producers to shop around. Obviously, there's everything in terms of commodities right now are all fairly expensive. With cows, a lot of times when we consider putting cows into a dry lot, we can use a limit feeding situation where we essentially, rather than feeding those cows at ad libitum intake, we can formulate a ration that's maybe a little bit higher in terms of its energy density and nutrient composition, and then feed that at a lower percentage of body weight. One of the common targets that I use is kind of a 2% dry matter intake level is kind of a situation that works well. As we do reduce that feed intake, those cows can become aggressive, so that's always something to take into consideration. The other consideration is bunk space. A lot of times with cows, we really don't want to go less than 20 inches of linear bunk space. And typically we would try to account for approximately 24 inches of linear bunk space for those cows. Now that can be both sides of a bunk if you figure that into that as well, if you're in some sort of a temporary situation. I did run a few pricing scenarios with some different, what I would call limit feeding scenarios for some cows, essentially using straw, alfalfa hay, and corn. In terms of the commodity prices there, I used a value of $70 a ton for the straw, around $180 for some alfalfa, and the corn at around $8. And if we look at those scenarios, depending on commodities there, we're easily looking at, ration prices that are going to be in excess of $200 per ton on a dry basis. So that would put our daily feeding cost somewhere in the range of between $2 and $3 per day. If we go back historically, in terms of dry lotting cows, we would normally be talking about scenarios where it would cost us somewhere between $1 and $1.75 per head per day. So if that gives some degree of the sense of magnitude of the difference in change of where we would be at, but there's certainly a lot of variables there to deal with. So I think I think that addresses all the components of that question there, Alyssa.
Taking a step back, we just had a question come in. So before we get into strategies, dry lotting, creep feeding, that type of thing, someone just asked, what is the best way to measure your available forage out in the pasture? So maybe Dr. Fick or Keith might want to address that one.
Well, the most accurate way to measure it would be to actually clip some sample frames and dry them down and get an actual weight measurement of those to estimate your dry matter yield or forage yield that you have available out there at the moment, or what your availability is. That's a pretty time consuming job. So another way that you could possibly do that would be to use what's it called, a grazing stick. Those grazing sticks are available. I believe the Kansas Grazing Land Coalition has them. They may be available in some NRCS offices, but basically what those grazing sticks are used for is you're measuring the height of the grass or the forage in your pasture in several locations. And then based on the height of the average height of the forage that you sampled, along with an estimate of how dense the forage is in that pasture, right on those grazing sticks, it has a formula for you to calculate what your available dry matter is. You calculate the height times a factor on that grazing stick to get a value for available dry matter at that time. And those are based off of several clippings that have been done over the years in all parts of Kansas, where they're correlating forage height with the amount of dry matter produced at those heights. And so that's how those are created on those grazing sticks, how those formulas are created. So those are probably the two methods that may be the easiest for a producer to do at any time, I guess, on short notice or easiest availability of being able to do it.
And Keith, you said we could find grazing sticks at potentially our local NRCS offices?
The Kansas Grazing Land Coalition has them, and at one time, some personnel with the NRCS did have those as well. I don't know where those may be located, what offices they may be at.
Okay.
But those are the two locations that I know of that they've been found in the past.
Okay, excellent.
I don't know if Walt has any idea of availability of those right now.
No, the Kansas Grazing Land Coalition has had to supply those over the years that we usually hand out at our range management schools. They'll be all held across the state this year in the month of August. The calculations now, I think there's just on the grazing stick, Keith, you look at that. Yeah, you use an estimate of that density and height, but then it just gives you an estimate of what the number would be. So it's not anything complicated. It may be something like 200 pounds per acre per inch of plant height, for instance.
Right.
So it's pretty straightforward. But and that'll give you a ballpark figure at least.
And if somebody does have one of those grazing sticks that they're able to find and use, because it has been a dry winter and a fairly dry spring, I would presume that most of the density evaluations that people would use for calculating that would probably be on the middle or possibly low range, because As we get more precipitation, we usually get more tillering, more density of vegetation. And I imagine that we're probably not going to have as much density because we haven't had as much water. So to be conservative, I would use the medium level on there, medium density to low density.
Okay, thank you guys. And then we had another question come in. So this one says, what are the opportunities for grazing CRP?
I can speak to that. As of now, no CRP is open for emergency grazing. But if we continue on this path, I would assume that will be a possibility later this summer. Right now, there are some FSA programs available. The livestock forage disaster program is available in 66 of our counties right now. And there's also some programs to help transport cattle to where feed is available or transport feed to your cattle. And those are all available through your Farm Service Agency office in a number of our counties right now.
Generally, that CRP grazing doesn't open till what, July 1 or so, after some nesting day, right? It's not as soon as we might want it, but it's more.
I believe it's typically July 15th as the end of the bird nesting period.
And typically, let me ask the group here, when they open for grazing, do they also open typically for haying at that same time? I'm seeing Robin nod her head yes. That's what
Yeah.
I was, John.
Yes, they would open haying at the same time, and there's stipulations based on the last time it was hayed or grazed. If you've done it you can only graze every other year, I believe, and hay every third year. But then there's also different CRP contracts, like SAFE is different than continuous CRP. So it depends on what the exact program they're enrolled in, how those rules.
If they do open up CRP for grazing and haying, one thing to keep in mind is that as we get later in the season and we start to graze or hay in an area, it's going to be lower in quality. So that's something for folks to think about, because those plants have had a chance to at least start their maturation process, to start to produce some stem tissue and get more lignin in it. So it's going to be lower in quality. And then CRP, if it's a field that was not following one of their say a burn year, there could be a lot of old dead dry matter inside of that CRP, and so that would also add on to the low quality of it, is having all that old dead dry material in there. So that's one thing for folks to think about, is that you're going to get some roughage and some tonnage, but it's going to be lower quality.
All great points on CRP. We have another question that came in. Any tips on stretching forage during grazing season, like splitting pastures, etc.?
But I guess one thing that splitting pastures would do is it would even distribution more. So you'd be able to take advantage and utilize some areas of pastures that maybe get less utilization under scenarios where they're free to roam throughout a large pasture. By breaking those down, you would even up your utilization and maybe capitalize on some areas that are often undergrazed. That's really going to be a matter of how large a pasture is, where water sources are, and those sorts of things. But it is something that folks may be able to capitalize on some by getting better distribution. One thing you'd have to do is you'd have to factor in the what cost are you able to do that at?
I might comment on, you know, if you have a multiple pastures for like a rotational grazing system, like Keith says, it would definitely probably even out your grazing distribution, which in the short term, that might be something you'd want to do. In the long term, though, what we've seen too of these pastures that have had more built-in rest in them will recover quicker from drought than those that do not. So that can be a, you know, advantage down the road. Since I'm talking, I guess I went and picked up my one of my grazing sticks here, and you know, I use that number 200 pounds per inch. Well, that's because I work in the eastern part of the state. That's not a bad number, but you get into the, say, central part of the state, mixed prairie, you know, it's probably even under medium density, no more than 150 pounds. And if you're out in the shortgrass country and in the high plains, you know, it's probably only 50. So you got to be, you know, be aware of that. Of course, production goes down as we go west.
So I see.
Can
Oh,
I jump in with another quick question to follow up on what Walt was saying? So Walt, when we get those numbers, so we say 50 pounds per square inch, what should we be wanting to have thinking about moving forward through the summer? Like what should we be aiming for? Or what should be a cutoff level for whether we keep cows on there or not?
So again, on the short grass country out where you're at, Jeannie, the you know, dominated by buffalo grass, blue grama, and Keith could comment on that as well. You know, we can graze them pretty short, you know, in terms of maybe stubble height, if you want to think of it that way. But reason for calculating that the amount of biomass we have is yeah, maybe determine maybe how many more days of grazing that we might have. And that all goes back into, you know, what class of animals are you grazing? Is it cows, cow-calf system, or you're running stockers? And then I'd answered a question here earlier about, then you need to know, you know, what percentage of their body weight are they apt to consume? And I like to use 2.6% for a cow or cow-calf pair, but NRCS, they're more conservative. They'll use something like 3%. But if you know, based on the amount of forage that you have, there is indeed a formula you can use to calculate, you know, how many more days of grazing that you might have available to you. If, you know, assuming you don't have any more growth. But that does take a little more complicated formula. Again, those, I've talked about those, again, the beef tip articles done, I think this year and in the past, we've talked about that formulas where you got to take your acres times the amount of production you have and yeah, what we call that harvest index, but then that's divided by the body weight. Yeah, well, the number of animals and the body percent of body weight they're consumed. Tell how many animals are out in the pasture, then that'll calculate for you how many days of grazing you would have. So I don't know whether that kind of answer your question or not, Jeannie, but it can be, one can use that information to estimate. And I think in this case, primarily what we're interested in is, yeah, maybe how many days of grazing we might have left. And you know, if we go out there and let's say that middle of June or end of June timeframe, and we determine what our current production is, and if that's, you know, 50% of what it should be, you know, then it's going to reduce the number of days we have available by quite a bit.
That does, Walt. I just want to make sure, I didn't know that I quite knew what if we had those numbers, how did that, what did that change for our management going forward? So thanks for explaining that. This is the agronomist asking the questions on pasture stuff. So these are conversations that we have at our house, making decisions on where cows are going. So,
you know, and I would just mention that we, you know, there's a number of kind of spreadsheet tools that kind of help you do some of those calculations, you know, how heavy the animals are, what you think about forage production. So if the oral discussion is not answering your question about some of those calculations, we can certainly work with you one-on-one and get you familiar with some of those tools to help you make those calculations. And sometimes it's just good to put some, you know, we kind of know what we've done, but how much to cut back is a little hard. And so if we put some numbers in a spreadsheet, for me, that helps me see, you know, how much we might really need to reduce in order to adapt to what's available.
So kind of further on the adapting for what's available, we had a question come in about early weaning and looking at those opportunities. So the specific question is, what's the earliest that someone can wean? And what do we need to be thinking about or concerned about when we early wean calves?
I can touch base a little bit on early weaning, and a lot of that's dictated. There's people have tried it a number of different ways. What's most often suggested, and you know, just for calf immunity, calf health, and growth potential, is we're really looking into that kind of 4 to 5 month old period of time. Where the calf kind of hits that's usually what's recommended, 120 to 150 days old as a calf. It can be done a little bit earlier. What we keep in mind, or some of the potentials that we try to keep in mind, is where the calf's immune system is. Their maternal antibody starts to wane at about 3 to 4 months of age. So planning ahead, if we are going to do an early wean situation, it is a kind of a key time to try to bolster and try to boost some of the immune system. By working with your local veterinarian, developing some of those early weaning vaccine programs to be able to decrease as much stress as possible. But oftentimes when we get into the discussion of early weaning is how are we going to manage those cats? Are we going to early wean and sell, or those animals we are going to maintain, we're going to feed? Do we have facilities? Do we have bunk space? Do we have, you know, water sources? You know, how are we going to manage those? So I'm sure Justin, you might chime in on that as well.
Yeah, so one of the common questions that comes up with early weaning calves, you know, or is that how early can we wean a calf? You know, what are their abilities to utilize a, you know, some sort of a feed ration or a weaning ration that's put into the pen? And actually, those calves have a functional rumen at 40 to 42 days of age. But from a practical standpoint, in terms of putting those calves in, I really like AJ's recommendation of around 100 to 120 days of age. I think that's a really good target. We've, you know, done several early weaning studies, and you know, that's kind of the target where we've worked around. I mean, traditionally early weaning is defined as anything less than 150 days of age typically. So, but those calves can utilize you know, concentrate feeds and a mixed ration, or even some sort of a weaning type pellet at that point fairly well. And so I would encourage producers 120 days on average, you know, looking at normal calving distribution is a pretty good target to utilize for implementation of an early weaning program. You know, obviously the nutrition is a big part of that. So we're dealing with, you know, fairly lightweight calves being placed into our facilities. So intake is often low. If we figure 1% of body weight and we're dealing with 300 to 500 pound calves, that's only 3 to 5 pounds of dry matter feed per day is what they're going to consume. So obviously, given that they have fairly high nutrient requirements, that's going to take a fairly nutrient dense diet to be able to meet those nutrient requirements. Now, the upside of that possibly is that those calves do tend to convert feed very well. It's not uncommon to see feed conversions of 3.5 to 4 to 1 on some of those smaller calves when we've managed the nutrition appropriately. So we can get acceptable levels of performance on those calves, but there certainly are some facility considerations. Can they reach the water tank adequately? What's the average height to the feed bunk, and some of those other considerations as well. So, but
Thank you. So another question came in. What are the other health issues that we should keep an eye out for during a drought? So beyond early weaning, but if calves are on cows out to pasture, are there any health concerns that we should be looking out for?
Yeah, and I'll tackle that. It can be a wide array, and a lot of it comes down to stress. When we have a drought situation, we have decreased nutrient intake or density of the milk they're consuming for the calves. Cows, again, nutrient restriction, it's a stress. We couple that with, the environmental swings or changes that they're going through dealing with wind. So all those stressors can potentially impact the immune strength. So some of our common issues for the calves, even on the cow, due to those added stressors, especially if maybe we are grouping cattle together to be able to feed them more effectively. Now we have more nose-to-nose contact that we increase risk of things like respiratory disease. So being prepared, yes, we talk about dust can impact, the lungs, maybe cause some pneumonia issues, but just, grouping cattle closer together increases that risk. So being prepared to treat some of our calves for respiratory disease, I think, is very important. The other ones that pop up that we don't normally talk about, but things like foot rot. Foot rot we usually attribute to very wet, walking through mud, things like that. But the dry arid areas, we can actually get chapping and actually cracking of the skin down along the hoof wall. That allows the bacteria to come in where we can still get increased rates of foot rot even during a drought. So it's kind of the two extremes, very wet and very dry. Well, we're in the very dry right now. I did mention dust with pneumonia, but dust can also be, pretty indicative with pink eye. It doesn't take much irritation to really cause some outer damage to the outer cornea of the eye. So being prepared to treat some of these common ailments that, on a year in and year out basis, we always deal with, it may, have slightly higher rates this year. Other health ailments, just, on the cusp is when cattle are looking for things to eat, sometimes they eat things they normally wouldn't. Where we can get into some more toxic plants, we can run into some nitrate issues. So there are some different things that kind of rear their ugly head during these drought situations, just because the cattle don't normally choose to eat some of those things.
Yeah, I was going to mention that part until you just touched on that. As we run low on quantity of forage, animals are oftentimes forced to eat things that they usually wouldn't if they have enough availability of grass and things that they prefer. So things like loco weeds, other poisonous plants out in pasture that they oftentimes wouldn't touch. Well, now some of those things may be the only things green out in the pastures for them to graze on when our grass starts to go dormant. So there are several poisonous plants that may be more palatable or to the animals at this time because they just don't have enough forage once they're undergoing a drought situation, just because the other forage isn't there.
To piggyback on that with toxic plants, depending on our water sources for our pasture-based systems, keep in mind if water is lacking, we have a concentration of any potential toxins that could be in a water source. So if we do have nitrates in some type of pond, we have reduction of water through evaporation and not refilling. We don't have the dilution effect where whatever water they are consuming, whether that's sulfur, whether that's iron, whether that's nitrates. We could, in looking at some of those toxic potentials, it's total consumption. So we do have to remember water is still a part of that total consumption.
All excellent points that you don't necessarily think about. So AJ, you were talking a lot about stress on the calves just a little bit ago, and we had a question come in about kind of human stress. So the question here is, we're seeing that K-State's doing a lot of farm stress things or ag stress. What can you kind of tell us about that, and how do we tackle kind of the hard situation we have going? Rachel, I think, are you able to tackle that one?
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that, I mean, I don't have to tell you all, but research actually suggests that farming and ranching is one of the, top 10 most stressful and dangerous occupations. And, it has its own unique set of stressors. That think about all the other jobs that some of these stressors that I'll talk about, they might have a few of them, but farming and ranching, I mean, all of these are involved of, weather you have to consider, economic and market prices, those government regulations that we've talked about, the production yield, livestock illness, debt and interest rate, whether machinery breaks down and you need new machinery and improvements, even when you bring in family disagreements or those kinds of things. And a lot of times failure to recognize those early warning symptoms of stress when you're managing it yourself can lead to illnesses, increased accidents on the farm, and sometimes even serious marital or family problems. And as you're talking here, you're talking about the stress of your herd, and you would never leave like a cow in stress. You would recognize it, you would deal with it, and you would help it. And I think a lot of times as humans, we overlook our stress and we just pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. We just kind of push it down a little bit further and we move on. And research shows that when we do this, we have a higher risk of heart attacks, we have a higher risk of high blood pressure, all these things that can be detrimental to our health. It can be detrimental to our loved ones. And so with K-State, we're partnering with 12 other extensions in the North Central region because the last Farm Bill, actually, the legislature put the money where their mouth was and put funding to really work on farm and ranch stress, because they realized, okay, we have a huge sector of the ag population that is being affected by death by suicide because this is so stressful, and we need to work on this because, we have a pandemic of COVID, but we really do have an epidemic of death by suicide and stress in our ag community. And so one thing that we're working on is trying to do education among our producers to help you understand where your signs of stress are. Machinery, you invest all this money in your operation, but your value as the producer is so much more that you need to be able to see, okay, I'm under stress and I need to take care of this, and I need to maybe go to my primary care doctor to get evaluated for the high blood pressure, be able to find ways that will help me mitigate my own stress so I can cope a little bit better and know what to do. So that's what we're working on. We have a team that's the stress and resiliency team that we have a website that has some resources, and I know we've shared some of those with you for the website that I believe that has been shared here, different websites that can be used, but really recognizing what your stress is, to know what to do once you've recognized it, to kind of, you've got all these tools that you use. Well, what tools can I use to kind of lessen my stress so I don't have all these problems later on? But also, one of the things that it's hard to talk about is death by suicide. And so we do have several trainings that deal with, one's called Question, Persuade, Refer. It's a suicide prevention because Kansas is really impacted by it, and a lot of it in our agricultural community, and trying to destigmatize the the talk about, mental health. If we can talk about it, it's not so hard to ask someone, hey, are you struggling? Do you need help? And I come from 4 generations of farmer. My husband's a 4th generation farmer. So I've been around farmers. I know that it's like, we're not just going to talk about it. We're just going to get the work done and go on. And that can be detrimental to our health. And K-State Research and Extension, we have some programs in place to try to help communities, educate and be able to see what those signs are, because if we can lessen the stress of our producers, we impact the families and the communities positively, and we can hopefully save lives as well. So you've got my contact information. If there's, you're interested in more training or more research resources, please contact me.
Thank you, Rachel. I see that Elisa also put a link to Ag Stress resources in the chat box, so make sure to check that out. Along the lines of stress and increased prices of things, we had a question come in that said trucking hay and or cattle is common during droughts and certainly adds to expenses. What do you see happening to fuel prices in the coming months? This might be best for Greg.
Yeah, do you mind if I could share my screen here? I'm an economist, so I kind of need to talk with the graphs. So let me find the one I'm looking for here. So yeah, if you look at fuel prices, not only have they gone up a lot, a lot of that increase in fuel prices actually happened during 2021, some more recently. But here's the thing I think I have a lot of producers kind of concerned is, if you look at the relationship between the diesel price here in red versus the gas price, you can see it's a fairly close relationship throughout history, at least the last year. It goes back further than that. But in the last couple of months here, this gap is really wide. So you're paying a lot more from diesel fuel than you would expect. And there's several things going on for them to kind of show you where we are. I have a trend line that predicts this. So here's about where the current diesel price is. The highway price, you can see it's about $5.50 per gallon. My model would say at current prices of $110 oil, they should almost be probably about $1 a gallon lower here. What's causing that kind of differential that we're seeing? Well, there's several things I think you can kind of blame that on. The biggest thing I think going on right now is what they call the crack spread the refiners do. When you look at the difference between the oil price and the price they're getting for their finished product, it's about as wide as it's ever been in its history here. You can see that this is quite a spread over what it typically is. A lot of that has to do with how much we're using our refineries, the utilization, and also the capacity. So we reduced some of our capacity during 2020 during COVID, which makes sense because people weren't driving as much. That has been slow to start back up for a variety of reasons. And I better watch what I say here because I could go down the political rabbit hole pretty quick on that one. But anyway, the capacity has been reduced and refinery utilization has been kind of reduced too during March or February through March, because they do maintenance typically during that time of the year. So we weren't refining as much diesel and gas during those periods as what we typically might. That has started to pick back up. It should increase over the next several months. Unfortunately, it's going to take a while for diesel prices to kind of catch up for this. So you can see here's our capacity over on this side, and here's our utilization over here. You can see we're behind. We're going to be catching up. What I think is going to happen is we'll be back up to our typical 95% utilization rate, which means we're pushing those refineries pretty hard. Again, we're a little bit lower in capacity, so expect to see diesel prices come down some. But with $110 oil, they're not going to come down all the way to what they normally would be. So expect to see, I would say, higher prices than what you used to, but probably not quite as high as what they are now. I would expect really a slow decline in diesel prices probably through about fall. And that's probably going to be where they're going to start to level off for a while. So unfortunately, this hits during the bad season especially for grain producers when you're trying to put out a crop and diesel prices are way above average. But hopefully by fall, they'll be a little bit lower, but they're still going to be high.
Thank you, Greg. So I guess on that, can anybody comment on the grain prices and kind of what the situation looks like there?
I can try to address that in just a second. Yeah, this is Dan O'Brien. Of course, we have tight supply demand prospects for U.S. crops and world crops. We've talked in other venues at KSU about the impact of the Ukraine-Russia war on the ability of the Ukrainian crop to come into world channels, especially, and that affects wheat and corn and sunflower, or the oilseed market in particular. Again, Ukraine was the #1 sunflower oil exporter, third or fourth wheat or corn exporter in the world. So them being taken out largely out of world markets has tightened things up just on its own. We've it's seen high fertilizer prices have an impact on corn acreage. So that's down about 3.5 to 4 million acres here in the US this year. Soybean acres up. So that's, that on the livestock side, that would affect that doesn't bring feed prices down, when you're constraining usage like that. So far, ethanol has held up decently, small decline, pretty strong corn exports. So in trying to focus on the grains that'll affect the livestock feeding industry or livestock industry, we're seeing, record high prices at corn futures in the last few days at $8 on the lead, about $7.50 or so for new crop, and the cash bids really strong. Southwest Kansas, so we've got a plus 60-80 cent basis for cash prices, for spot prices, plus 40 or so for new crop bids, and generally pretty strong bids around the country. So without going too long on this, we have really strong markets, tight supply demand, world supply demand challenges coming into play. What's happened the last couple of days seems to be more driven in terms of markets coming down in the grains, driven by happenings in the overall national economy, with the Fed coming in and raising interest rates to try to combat inflation, and reports from businesses indicating that their earnings and sales are really suffering, mainly because of inflation and its impact on consumers. We've had these other financial market factors coming and affecting the commodities. So you're really in danger if you ask the economists what's going on in the grain markets. You've talked way too long. So the point is that yeah, we have really high prices, and maybe the question is, will this sustain? Will we see this all the way through fall? I think on just supply demand grounds, it takes one crop at least to produce enough grain to get out of a hole, and we're in a hole in terms of low supplies for these crops. So it's hard. We'll have ups and downs, a lot of volatility, but it's hard to see us really changing into a strong down market absent financial market problems until we get out into 2023. At least that's my perspective on it.
Thank you. We had another question come in, just switching gears real quick. What about creep feeding this year? Will it decrease pressure on the pasture? I know I've read some articles about early weaning and how much that decreases forage utilization, but does anybody want to comment on how creep feeding will decrease pressure on the pasture?
You'll see a substantial increase in the cost, and so you might be saving and stretching grass on one side, but then you're incurring some incredible costs on the other. That's a case-by-case basis. If you are in a proximity of maybe finding something that you can pencil in, we certainly recommend limit creep feeding, not more than 2-3 pounds, maybe at most. some good work done in the past up in Northwest Kansas has shown some really good conversion rates that Justin pointed out earlier.
You know, and I would just add in, I think there's, they've tried to look at whether or not creep feeding does, you know, take any pressure off the cow or really off the pasture. And I think it's really pretty minimal, if any. So the decision is strictly based on the cost of the feed and, you know, what's your marketing endpoints and how that fits together. So.
I just completed a fall herd creep feeding study where we were feeding the cows hay so that we did have actual hay intake to kind of correlate that to pasture. And it did not help. The calves were quite a bit heavier, the creep feed calves, but in regards to fatter cows, you know, cows being better condition or less hay, we did not see an improvement. Well, this is our first of 3 years that we are looking at that.
Okay, so we've kind of hit a lot of topics in this hour. Is there anything else from specialists that you guys wanted to cover or want to add in here?
I guess I would just say that I think one of the best proven ways to save forage is just through the early weaning. So just doing that management practice, I think, is one of the best ways to stretch forage further. Folks in South Dakota have actually measured the actual forage left out in pasture from herds that were early weaned versus those that weren't, and there was an actual savings or stretching of the forage from that. I also wanted to point out that we talked about stocking rates earlier, and in the chat area, I attached a simple little spreadsheet of how to calculate a stocking rate spreadsheet that I use for myself and also for producers or anyone that has questions about it that calls me. I often send them this spreadsheet so they can work through calculating stocking rates on their own computer. And if anybody downloads that and has questions about it, they can contact me and I will walk them through it.
This is Dan O'Brien. I think I have concerns. I think we all have concerns about what inflation and costs are doing on both the crop and livestock side. I just encourage university folks, along with the producers that are on this, to be watchful of how this run up in costs could eventually start affecting our decisions. So it's just something to really watch. Fuel, much less all the supply chain issues that are making it difficult to get hold of inputs it can have a cascading effect. I'm not trying to just use hyperbole, but these are very inflationary times. And for us, I just hope we just don't want to be blindsided by costs running up so high that it starts to impact what our normal decisions are.
I don't know if the agronomists have any magic. You can change some of the use of these fields to plant anything. I suppose they don't want to give up any high grain prices, but I guess that would be a question I'd throw out to them, is they see any way that we might alter any use of those current cropping acres. It's just a pipe dream of Sandy's.
Well, I think there might be a few opportunities. We don't have a lot of irrigated wheat acres. But, if forage prices stay where they are, I think we will see people attempt to double crop some forage sorghum or something behind, after wheat harvest. Wheat's progressing way ahead of schedule. So that will make that window of opportunity a little broader. Let us get, someone's wanting to double crop some forage sorghum or something, get it in there a little quicker because of how much faster this wheat's coming along. Of course, dry land, we're all going to be dependent on whether it starts raining again someday, what our opportunities there will be. But I do think people are going to look at where we're at on some of these forage prices and consider shifting some acres or looking for some recrop opportunities. But and it's obvious it's the things that we kind of do anyways. We want things that grow lots of biomass for not very much water, and so millets and sorghums are really kind of the tools we've got in that regard.
I would just add, it's going to be very hard for forages to compete with the current price of grain crops. But if this drought does continue, there could be some crop failures, and you might look at salvaging some grain crops for forage use, and those crops or crops grown for forage under drought stress, we do tend to see the increased chance of nitrate. So want to measure that. There are ways to manage that high nitrate, but the first step is to measure it so we know what we have to work around.
Got kind of a two-part question. And the first part is, Greg, do you anticipate fertilizer situation next year will be appreciably different than one we have now? And if it's not, and it's difficult to get row crops in, does that push us to some forages?
Well, based on my fertilizer model, that's based on a prediction of using corn price, the oil price, and inflation expectations. I don't really see fertilizer prices backing off a little bit. And I'm kind of a little bit more concerned about the potash situation, because that's the one thing we don't produce in the U.S. I think could be affected by the Russian-Ukraine war, and it hasn't kept up with the anhydrous price either. So potash could actually be a lot higher for next year, whereas I think at least the other fertilizers are probably at least hold steady.
So that's what I'd wonder. We don't. There'll be a time X months from now when we'll have to start thinking about what crops we're going to put in again. Where does that put us next year if we have these same problems we have now? So maybe there's an opportunity in terms of the choice of forages that could go in that we could be watching for.
I guess while we're on that topic, John, you've got, we've covered this at some of our fertility schools this winter, but you've just finished up some work looking at nitrogen on forage sorghum, both the economics and impacts on quality. You want to summarize that right quick or point people to where they can find that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, Lucas. So we did done nitrogen response work in Western Kansas and Eastern Kansas, and it was kind of a similar situation, and that yield on a forage sorghum crop was optimized around 50 pounds per acre per cutting. So under irrigated situations, we'd recommend split applying that, because when we went over 50 pounds per acre, then we increased the chances of nitrate. Given the current, well, the price of forages has gone up quite a bit since I did that analysis too. But at that point in time, it would have suggested backing off the amount of nitrogen applied by about 10 to 15% to reach an economic optimum. But now that the cost of forage is up, it's probably back to that 50-pound mark. But I would caution that if you're in a drought area and looking at adverse conditions, I would consider backing that nitrogen rate off just to try to help minimize the chance of the risk of nitrate. There are some things we can do with nitrate. We can ensile. That'll reduce it by about half. If we're in a situation where we're having a total mixed ration, we can help feed feed it if we can have some other feed that's not high in nitrate. It is a bit of a risk, but the other thing is that the nitrate is highest concentration lower in the plant. So the higher we cut that plant off, the less risk we're going to have of having nitrate in the plant as well.
Just along the lines of talking about nitrates, we should probably emphasize how important it is to have a good representative sample when we're doing sampling for nitrates. Just a couple of stalks that you pull out of the field is probably is not enough. And so get a hold of us if you're doing nitrate sampling, because we need to be sampling multiple, if you have it in bales, multiple bales. We do have cores that can be checked out of many of the extension offices. If you're collecting out in the field, we can talk about how many stalks and parts of stalks that we need to be collecting for getting a good representative sample of nitrates. There are some quick tests that can be done, but they don't really give us a number. They just kind of say, maybe you should be more concerned and go ahead and collect the sample and do more extensive testing on it. So many times when we're sending nitrate tests in, they don't take a great long time to get results back. And so I think that's an important part of when we're talking about drought stressed on any of our crops out in the field, whether it's sorghum, whether it's corn, field corn, or even when we're thinking about grazing on weeds, for example, we can still have problems with nitrate concerns. So just getting a good representative sample of what cows are going out on, I think, is very important.
We did have one last minute question come in. So the question was thoughts on destocking now. So if anybody wants to chime in on that.
I just posted a response and I'm basing it on GrassCast, which some of you may know about, and you can go look at it, based on below normal precipitation this summer. And I think that's probably likely, particularly for the central and western Kansas. I think a 30% reduction would be something to think seriously about. The early weaning that's been mentioned, will basically accomplish that, because I think the data I've seen would suggest that the requirements for the cow drop about that percentage when you wean the calf. So that's one way to accomplish it. If you can wean early, take the calves off the cows and get them off the pasture. Otherwise, look at your calling practices. I know Jamie Lynn mentioned, for their fall cows, but if you've got open cows, or they're getting older and the lower producing animals in your herd, those would be ones to look at. Send them to town. I'm not a weather person at all, but the projection sure would indicate, even though here in eastern Kansas we're in pretty good shape right now. Some places have had more rain than we need right now, but you look at the drought monitor, like I say, 2/3 of the state's drier than normal. In some places, in very extreme drought. What do you think, Keith? Is that out of whack, or is that?
I would just say, go back to what you mentioned earlier, that I think it's more critical if you're short on forage to be destocked during the last half of the season versus the first half, because that's the time of the year when our grasses are, they're needing that leaf material in order for photosynthesis to occur, so they can store carbohydrates for the winter, so that they can start next season as vigorous as possible. So you could be on the more cautious side and destock now. That's certainly something you can do, and you'll increase the vigor that much more. I would say that we still have some time left, though, in May and June, where we still could get some precipitation events to occur. And so I guess I would say on the cautious side, you could do it, but we still have some time period left where we could get some rain and get some grass growth. We still have a lot of growing season left. But if you're going to destock, definitely during the last part of the season is the most crucial part.
You know, and another part of that is, you know, how much did you leave after the last grazing season? And, you know, I can certainly appreciate how slow and behind our forage is now. And so you do have to have enough out there for cows to eat. And if you're spring breeding or spring calving, there's got to be enough energy for them to lactate and do what you want to do.
The thing I would add to that too is I think also giving some consideration to cull cow prices as well as the value of some of those pairs. If producers have cows that for a variety of reasons or that they may not want to own anymore, we can call it a culling strategy, if you will. But we've got a few economists on here, but I think our cull cow prices have still remained fairly strong right now through this part of the. So there may be an opportunity there, not necessarily from a destocking perspective, but just if you wanted to maybe clean up those herds for maybe tighten up a calving distribution or something like that. And especially even the value of pairs. I've also watched that a little bit, and I think those have still been fairly strong. So maybe use that as an opportunity and, you know, and continue to hope for some additional precipitation.
So we had a question just come in here. If you were looking at early weaning, would it be beneficial to creep feed for 30 to 45 days to help transition those calves over to feed? So either Dale or Justin.
You know, I can comment on that a little bit. You know, I don't know that it's necessarily that we would, you know, need to necessarily creep feed those calves. And I think we can just present them a little bit of that weaning diet, maybe as little as 2 to 3 times before that weaning event takes place, and actually see some benefits to that. So it wouldn't necessarily have to be what we think of as a 30 to 45 day, you know, creep feeding type program. We could do that with a much shorter duration and probably at much lower cost if we were to do that. And Dale, you might have some other thoughts on that as well.
No, I agree with you wholeheartedly, Justin. Again, run the pencil on the cost of this feed. We're in an escalating feed cost environment, and anything we can do to try to keep our efficiencies at the best they can be is the way to go.
Really, all we have to do on a weaning program is simply just expose those calves to whatever that feed is going to be. It isn't something that has to be fed for certainly a long duration and then bring them up on feeds. So you can initiate that as, you know, really just immediately prior to weaning if you need to.
All right, so it looks like we're pretty close to wrapping up here. I just want to share my screen one more time here. Can you guys see that presentation?
Yes.
Okay, so we have a number of resources that match the topics that our specialists have talked about today. So those are available on the ksubeef.org website listed here. Rachel has put in some ag stress information as well. So that's a really good resource to go check out. And then producers, if you guys have any questions after this, get a hold of any of the specialists on here or some of your local extension offices, and we can head you in the right direction. So Sandy, did you have anything else you wanted to say?
Yeah, well, I just as in closing, I feel like we've had a good discussion. I hope people have been able to hear some things that help clarify some thoughts to make some of the decisions that are on their minds. And, you know, we've been through droughts before. Now you may be in a different position as a decision maker, but you know, we've been through droughts before and we're going to be through them again. And one thing I can tell you, I have done drought programming this time of year and it started raining. And so that's really our hope, is that by talking about drought and calling this type of meeting, where this is our rain dance, and we hope it's good. If by some stretch of the imagine this rain dance doesn't work, we'd be happy to continue to work with you on whatever issues arise as you're trying to manage around all these factors. And you see the hostess specialists that we brought together today, and really that's the team that you have on your side, and you merely need to reach out and help us figure out how to help you. So with that, I appreciate your attendance here today, and hope that you have a great rest of your day and look forward to the next rain.